Welcome back to the channel. If you follow us on Instagram, you may have recently seen that I finished a cash register stand for here in the store. One of our problems that we're having with it is that on top of here, we're trying to store or display our business cards and some of our price lists. And I think this could be done a lot better. So today we're going to be building a wood and epoxy stand to hold these items. And this project will start off a new series for us, designed for the beginner woodworkers. We get a lot of people here in the store that are new to the woodworking field and that they have a lot of questions that hopefully this series will address and give them some confidence when you go off as a new woodworker into a store that could be a little intimidating, to give you some advice on some of the basics. So we'll have some how-tos and some projects and some information for you on this new series. So today we're going to start with our dimension list, or our dimension drawing, I should say, for our project. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a wooden base with a live edge on the front, and we're going to have a spot in the back for our service menu and price lists, and then a section in the front for our business cards to go and our gift cards. And then the back section here is going to be our wood on the bottom with a live edge, and then we're going to be pouring an epoxy pour on top of that for the back. So I just so happen to know of a good store that would have everything that we're going to need for this project. So let's go shopping. We got all of our supplies we're going to need, and we're out in the shop now, and we'll go over what we picked out. So we're going to use a live edged walnut board, and then we have our epoxy that we're going to use is going to be our new to us, so we've never used this before. So this is Ecopoxy's newest release. So this is their flow cast SPR, which is small project resin. So the advantage of this over their original flow cast is that this is up to 1-inch pours, and it dries in 24 hours versus 72 hours for their original flow cast deep pour. So this will be perfect for our project, since ours will be about 3/4 of an inch thick pour. So we have our mixing bucket that we can mix everything in. We're going to end up coloring ours. So we selected Ecopoxy's metallic pigments. So this is just a metallic powder that will mix in with the epoxy. We have our no leak mold form here. So this will be perfect for pouring into, so we don't have to worry about anything leaking out or sealing anything up. We have a few clamp blocks so that we can put our board in here and get it clamped down tight to the mold. And then we have some mold release so that we can spray in here so that this will come out nice and easy. So first step will be to process our board. We got to put a straight edge on one side of this board. So I'm going to choose the edge that is already non-live edge, so it's already square. I just need to clean it up. So the method I'm going to use is just a regular old skill saw and a level. This happens to be a 6-foot level for our length of board that we need. So the first thing I'm going to do is flip my saw over, take my tape, and I'm going to measure the offset from the edge of the blade to the edge of the base, which in this saw should be 5 inches. So now when I go over to my board, I'm going to want to take, let's say like 1/8 of an inch off this just to clean it up and get it straight. So I'll set my saw, or my straight edge, to 5 1/8. And I will clamp my straight edge down to my board. Go ahead and double check and verify that that is what I have. And that'll work. I'll go ahead and run my saw across here. So now that cut there could have been performed in several different options. So if you have access to a joiner, that would have been a good job for that. You could have used that to put a straight edge on there. This system works here just fine. You could use a track saw. Just basically anything that'll give you a nice straight edge to reference off of. So now that we have that edge cut, we're going to go ahead and refer back here to our drawing. And we'll see that we have an overall length that we need for that back piece of wood to be right here of 24 inches. And that'll be the same for the bottom piece. So now I will unclamp this and I will head over to the miter saw and we'll get this cut up into two 24-inch lengths. So now over at the miter saw, what I'm going to do is perform one straight cut first and then measure over 24 inches, make another cut, and then another 24 will get us our two pieces that we need. So now that we have our two pieces here, rough cut to length, we will go ahead and get these planed down on both sides. Okay, so that makes quick work of planing stuff down. You definitely do not need a machine like that to do this. Any sort of planer would work, or even if you do not have access to a planer, there are plenty of shops around that will do services like this for you, have something planed down for you, so you can, don't let that stop you from doing something like this. So now that we have it planed down and smoothed, our next thing to do is going to be to go back to our drawing. And we can see that our wood, we want 3 inches to 5 inches, approximately somewhere in that area. So on this board, we are 11 3/8 wide. So I'm going to mark our 5 inch on this side. So I know I want a piece from right there, 5 inches. Now, the only problem with that is that our mold is 12 inches wide. So we want a final dimension of our back piece to be 9 inches. So if we have 5 inches of wood, we're gonna need an extra 3 inches left on here to fill in our mold so that we don't have to over pour our epoxy, which is way more expensive than this board is gonna be. So we'll just leave 3 inches on this board. So we'll go 5, and we'll add 3. So we'll mark that at 8 inches. So that is where I'm going to rip this board down to. So if I measure from this edge, which this edge is a nice straight piece that we already cut. So I can see that that is 3 3/8 wide. So now there's one thing I didn't mention over there is that since we are cutting, and this is our good piece, and this is going to be our scrap, I set a dimension from 3 3/8 from this surface to the line. Well, if I set my saw blade up to 3 3/8, that is going to be 3 3/8 from this edge of the saw blade, not this edge of the saw blade. So I need to subtract 1/8 of an inch off, which is the thickness of this blade, so that that kerf will go on the scrap side of the board. Hopefully that makes sense. And now we're going to cut that. Over and get the edge all cleaned up. Okay, so now I got my board clamped back down to the bench. I'm just going to use a standard chisel here to get rid of the bulk of this bark. So some of this stuff will just peel off of there, but other stuff like this chunk here is on there pretty good. So I just take my chisel and pop it off, clean up anything that looks like it's going to give you problems. So now you're going to want this edge to be nice and clean. So all of this sort of loose extra pieces of bark, you're going to have to get off of there so the epoxy will actually bond to your base wood and not this little dirty edge of the bark. So I'm going to grab a sander here real quick. Okay, now that we got our board edge all sanded down, we'll go ahead and grab our mold here. And we're going to place our board in there. It should fit nice and snug. And now we're going to go ahead and calculate the volume of epoxy that we have left in the mold so that we can pick the proper kit that we're going to need to use. So what I like to do is something that doesn't have a nice straight clean edge is to take multiple measurements across your board and then get an average of your width that you're going to have. So we're going to start here. You can see that right there. So that's 6 inches. So I'll write a 6 there. Then we got 5. We'll call that 4 1/4. And 4 1/4. And then we know that we're 24 inches wide. So we can do a simple calculation. We'll have 6 and a 5 and a 4 1/4 and a 4 1/4. We'll divide that by our 4 measurements that we took, which gives us an average of 4 7/8 times our 24 inches width. And then now you would go ahead and measure your thickness of your board. So we are at 3/4 of an inch. So we would times that by 0.75 for 3/4, which gives us a total of 87 3/4 cubic inches. So if we have our chart that we have up, and this is on Ecopoxy's website, there's a little QR code that you could scan so that you could find out exactly what they recommend for their volume that'll cover. So we know that we're 87 3/4, so we're going to find 91 1/2, which would mean that we're going to need a 1.5 liter kit, and I would round up from our 87 to probably about 90. So we'll go ahead and just mix the whole 1.5 liter kit to pour in here, because you're going to lose some. You're going to want to over pour it a little bit so that when it shrinks down, it's still level with your board, and you're going to lose some around the edges and stuff. It'll seep around the corners. So you'll want a little bit extra. And this board here doesn't have any voids in the board itself, but if you did have a board that had some voids, you would have to account for a knot or a pinholes or anything like that. That epoxy is going to want to go down and fill. So you might want to round up a little bit more. So now that we got our measurements taken and we know which kit we're going to use, let's get our mold prepped and our board prepped for a pour. So we're going to start off with the board. And I like to just take some old 80 grit sandpaper. I'm just going to scuff up my edge that I sanded. Just to give that edge a little bit more tooth for that epoxy to bond into. So now, what I like to do is use some acetone or something like that, spray my board down, and then take a lint-free cloth. Just go ahead and wipe your board. What that does is you're trying to get rid of all the dust and dirt and wax and any oils or anything that's on the edge of your board so that your epoxy bonds. And then I like to try to not to touch it too much after that. Just kind of grab it by the edge and set it off to the side. And then we're going to do the same thing with our mold. This thing will spray. There we go. Again, just a lint-free cloth. And what you're trying to do is just get rid of all that dust and dirt and hair and anything that's in there. So now I'm going to go ahead and get this blown out with the air gun off camera and spray it with my mold release. And you're going to do it just like a baking pan you would with that. So you're going to coat it liberally with your mold release so that this thing will pop out easily when you're done. Now, a tip that I would recommend doing is spraying this away from where you're going to be pouring. So you don't want to get your mold release. This spray will go everywhere, and you don't want to get it on the edge of your board that you're going to try to bond your epoxy to. This stuff will act as a release agent, so its whole goal is to get two pieces to separate. So if you get any on this surface here, then that is exactly what's going to happen. Your epoxy is going to come off of your wood. So I will go take this and spray that down, and I'll be right back. We got everything all sprayed here, so that looks nice. Now we're going to take our board. Just go ahead and gingerly place that in there. And then we have these clamp blocks that we're going to use. So we want to make sure that we push this board down into the bottom of the mold. So what will happen is if you pour it just like this now, and you pour a bunch in here, that'll actually make the wood float up into your epoxy. It'll go underneath your board. So we want to prevent that from happening. So we have these little blocks so that if you put your clamps just on the board and you pour epoxy in and it goes over, you're going to pour epoxy all over your clamps. So by using these, nothing will stick to these. These are the same material as the plastic form. So now we'll just go ahead and run some clamps. So now we have that nice and clamped down. We'll go ahead and get our epoxy mixed up. So we're just going to use a bucket here. And now, like I said earlier, this project here just so happened to come out to be a full kit. So we will just use this whole, both bottles. So it is a 2-to-1 mix. So you have 2 parts to 1 part. Okay, so if you weren't going to be doing what we're doing and use the whole kit, this makes our measurements pretty easy. But you want to be as accurate as you can be when you measure that 2-to-1 ratio. So most problems that you're going to have are going to be with mixing or getting the wrong ratio. So if you have an epoxy that doesn't set up, if you have an epoxy that's still sticky after it's supposed to be hard, that's probably what went wrong, is this step right here is where you're going to mix it and make sure that you scrape the edge of your bucket, get to the bottom of your bucket, make sure that that is well mixed up. I mix mine for about 4 minutes. That will depend on what epoxy you use. This, I believe, recommends a 3-minute mix time. So I try to go over that just so that I make sure that it is well mixed up. And I know a lot of people want to rush this process just because of the fact that they think this is going to start setting up on them too quick. This has an open working time of about 4 or so hours, 4 to 5 hours, depending on your temperature and humidity and all that affects that. But you have plenty of time to work on that, so make sure you mix it well. Okay, so I'm using a paddle mixer for this. It's a little bit more quantity than is fun to mix by hand. But something I like to do is go get a scrap stick, and I'm gonna go grab one here. I have a whole pile of them over here. So let me go grab one. And something you're gonna wanna do is if you're doing it by hand, you're gonna do this kind of automatically as you go. You're gonna wanna scrape down your edges. Because I don't know if you can see that on camera, but see how it has these, see how it has these swirls in it still? So as I scrape along the side, I'm pulling either a part A or a part B of that mixture off the side. And all that needs to be incorporated. When you're done, this thing should be crystal clear. So if you still see swirls and stuff in your mixture, that means you still need to mix it more. And I like to scrape across the bottom and get kind of down in that corner. And I wouldn't worry too much about the air bubbles. If you are mixing this by hand, I'll kind of show you a technique that some people are going to try to want to fold that in like that. and all you're going to do is work in a bunch of air bubbles that are going to then have to come up through the surface and pop. If you would just mix more like this, make sure you move the bucket around, that will lead in a lot less air bubbles that you're going to have to deal with later on. Now, since this does have a fair drying time and it is thin, these air bubbles will pop all on their own. But the fewer you have, the less likelihood you're going to have bubbles in your finished product. All right, I'll go ahead and mix this for a few more minutes and we'll be right back when I'm done. So we got that all mixed up. So now this is a very optional step, but most people want to color to their epoxy. So we're going to add a, you can see that, a metallic pigment. So this has, this is just a metallic powder that we're going to add in here. And now this varies on what you're going to be, how much you're going to be doing, and what your end result you want is. We want something that is fairly opaque. So we're just going to go ahead and slowly pour this in. And so I know now is a real tempting thing, if you can kind of see in here how much we have left over. There's still quite a bit in that bucket. And I know it's a real tempting thing to take a stick and go ahead and scrape all that stuff out of there. But what that is usually the sides are the part that doesn't get mixed. I know you went around and tried to scrape the sides down and get that to mix, but that usually is where all your problems are going to be, is on the edge. So I try to refrain from grabbing all of that extra stuff. I know it's expensive, but just you're better off leaving that in the bucket instead of trying to scrape the sides down and have that unmixed portion come into your pour and cause some problems for you. So now, one thing that I like to do that is unnecessary really with this project, or with this epoxy, is I like to pop the bubbles. It's just kind of a fun thing to do. So I use a torch, and I set it down to about as low as it'll go, and just real quickly you're gonna fan across there, and all those little bubbles will go away. So I'm just gonna cover this up here and let this set, and we'll see you again tomorrow after about 24 hours, and we'll see how this is doing.